So from thinking about these two diseases, you can gather that because tissues are living, they're very dynamic and they can change. Sometimes they change in good ways and sometimes they change in bad ways. So for now, we're going to talk about the few types of tissue transformations that we'll see in this course, starting with metaplasia, which is when one tissue is replaced by another tissue type. This can happen pretty much anywhere inside the body, but one place where we find metaplasia is in a condition called Barrett's esophagus, which affects the esophagus of smokers, and yes, most likely you vape lords out there as well. Now, typically, the lower esophagus is formed from mucus-secreting epithelia and ciliated epithelium. But when those cells get exposed to the chemicals and carcinogens in smoke, they get replaced with squamous epithelium. This can cause the esophagus to be more susceptible to acid erosion from the stomach. It can contribute to the chronic cough that we see in smokers. And in many cases, it will turn into esophageal cancer, which unfortunately has a very poor prognosis. Hypertrophy is another type of tissue transformation, which is when a tissue grows because the cells become larger. The phrase that people often use to describe hypertrophy is cell growth in the absence of cell division. Hypertrophy can happen in many places and for a number of reasons, but it generally follows the use it or lose it principle. In other words, the more you use something, the bigger it gets. But of course, there are exceptions. An example of this would be your heart. If you were to compare the heart of an athlete who runs marathons to, say, my heart, which is lucky if it gets to take a walk up a flight of stairs once in a while, you'd probably see that the athlete's heart is bigger because the cardiac muscle cells are bigger. And that allows them to contract more forcefully and pump more blood out to their very athletic body. But bigger doesn't always mean better. So you'd also see cardiac hypertrophy in someone who is experiencing heart failure. In that case, their cardiac muscle cells grew larger because they were trying to compensate for the fact that the heart was failing and no longer working as efficiently. But in that case, while the cells are bigger, they're actually weaker as opposed to being bigger and stronger. And actually, one of my research interests is to try to understand the difference between cardiac hypertrophy in athletes and cardiac hypertrophy in heart failure patients. But there's still a lot of details that we don't know. One other example of overgrown tissues is hyperplasia, which is when you have an increase in cell proliferation. So one example of this that affects people that have Y chromosomes is BPH, or benign prostatic hyperplasia. This results in an enlarged prostate. This often pushes on the bladder, which is located nearby, and so that's one of the reasons why you might hear an older grandparent complaining that they have to pee all the time. It's important to mention that in this case of hyperplasia, the tissues are growing through normal mechanisms and normal growth pathways that are just being activated a little bit more frequently. In other words, hyperplasia is not cancer. In fact, maybe a better example of hyperplasia would be the calluses that you develop on your fingers if you play certain sports or musical instruments instead. If you do have the growth of a tissue because the cells have transformed into a cancerous state, then that's known as a neoplasia. And again, neoplasias can impact all the tissues that we've talked about and all the tissues that we'll talk about in this entire course. So in the right example, we're looking at a solid brain tumor, which is an example of a neoplasia. And in the left image, you're looking at a blood cancer, leukemia, which is also an example of neoplasia. Now, in order for tissues to be dynamic, they have to be replaced at the end of their life cycle. And this happens most often through a process called apoptosis, or programmed cell death. Usually, apoptosis occurs in response to injury or viral infection. And the major characteristic that you saw in the video is that the cell remains compartmentalized. If you look closely, you can see that most of the organelles get wrapped in membranes, and that allows them to keep their contents safely contained until they can be broken down. That process, called blebbing, a very, very scientific term, I know, is characteristic of apoptosis. We can contrast that with the other video, which is showing us necrosis, or uncontrolled cell death. In this situation, the plasma membrane is usually ruptured in response to some kind of physical or chemical trauma, and the cell doesn't get the opportunity to break down in a coordinated way like we see in apoptosis. Instead, in this case, the contents just spill out into the interstitial environment, and often that damages the surrounding tissues. And so for this reason, necrosis is considered to be abnormal and extremely undesirable inside the body. Now, on a happier note, tissues can also be replenished. Most somatic cells that are terminally differentiated can undergo mitosis to replace cells that have been lost through the process of apoptosis. But even those cells have to originate from somewhere during development. And in some cases, terminally differentiated tissues like muscle and neurons aren't able to undergo mitosis. So the answer to both of these problems is stem cells. Stem cells are undifferentiated or unspecified cells that can give rise to many cell types, especially early in development. The term used to describe this is potency. Stem cells can undergo asymmetric cell division, which produces two daughter cells, one being a stem cell and one being a slightly less potent or slightly more committed daughter cell. So two unique cell types are produced. They can also divide symmetrically to produce two identical cells, like, for example, two stem cells. During development, stem cells tend to lose their potency. So in the early stages of life, most cells are totipotent, which means they can give rise to any cell type inside the body. Even as we continue through embryonic development, we still have stem cells that can become any cell type. Although they're functionally similar to totipotent cells, we typically refer to those cells as pluripotent to denote the fact that they're found at a later stage of life. Now, this is one of the reasons why people are so interested in embryonic stem cells from a research standpoint. They can give rise to pretty much anything. But even as adults, we have stem cells, although they're not pluripotent anymore. Most are either multipotent or unipotent. Multipotent stem cells are committed to becoming only one category of tissue. So, for example, multipotent stem cells might give rise to endoderm, which makes up organs. Others could give rise to mesoderm, which makes up blood and muscle, and others could give rise only to ectoderm, which makes up skin and nerves. Unipotent stem cells, on the other hand, are even more specific. So, for example, they might give rise to only a particular type of blood cell, like a red blood cell or a white blood cell, or only a particular type of muscle, like skeletal muscle. In fact, the osteoprogenitor cell that we talked about earlier in this unit is a really good example of a unipotent stem cell. It gives rise to one cell type, the osteoblast.